Life is becoming harder in Ukrainian cities as winter sets in and the supply of power and heat become uncertain. Winters are harsh in this part of the world, and people in big cities cannot survive for long periods without heat. Russia's campaign to cripple Ukraine's power infrastructure could therefore trigger a new wave of emigration to Europe. As Russia's position on the battlefield becomes more precarious, Putin may resort to more terroristic threats against nuclear facilities or other irresponsible actions. Ukraine is for sure on a path to victory, but how long will it take and what will be the eventual cost? Please like and subscribe to see more of our great guests and content on the Silicon Curtain channel. Today I'm speaking to Ben Hodges, former Commanding General, US Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. Ben is now Senior Advisor at Human Rights First, and until recently was the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, specializing in NATO, the transatlantic relationship, and international security. Ben, this is the second time on the channel. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you back.
Jonathan, thank you. I can't believe you let me come back again.
Well, you didn't disgrace yourself the first time, so I thought we'd have another crack at it. Let's start with Kherson, because this is one of the big pieces of news, and it's one of those sort of punctuated victories we get every couple of months, this huge rout of Russian forces. Now, was this a humanitarian gesture on the part of Russia by withdrawing, or did Ukraine force them out?
Well, of course, this was a significant victory by Ukrainian forces, but two or three things really strike me about this. Not humanitarian in nature at all, but clearly General Surovikin, the new operational commander of Russian forces, has been given authority to do some things that nobody else could do before. I mean, he would have recognized weeks ago that they needed to get out of Kherson and on the to the other side of the Dnipro River. And so a good operational decision for the Russian side, but humiliating for the Kremlin, which is why I think the announcement of the decision was played out on Russian TV. I mean, that's not the kind of thing that typically would be broadcast, but that was a little bit of theater to spare the president of the Russian Federation the humiliation of being directly associated with it. But I still don't know yet how much was left behind, how many Russian troops, equipment and stuff. No doubt it would have been significant. And this puts Ukrainian forces in a really good spot now for the next couple of months, where I think they are going to pound Russian defenses and logistics in the southern part of Ukraine in the approaches to the Crimean Peninsula.
And how much of that peninsula is now within the range of HIMARS and potentially in the longer range systems?
So there was an excellent map that came out on Twitter about 2 weeks ago that showed concentric rings around Kherson. If you imagine HIMARS being brought up to the river or somewhere thereabouts, which is what I imagine the Ukrainian armed forces will do, the current type of rocket, the GMLRS rocket that has the range of 90 kilometers, can range all the way to the Perekop Isthmus, that narrow bit of land that connects Crimea to the mainland of Ukraine, if you will. And that part will be within range from Kherson. But without getting the ATACMS, the longer range system, we still can't hit facilities on Crimean Peninsula yet.
And do you think
not with rockets? Now, drones, obviously, yes, but not with rockets.
And there seems to be a key distinction, doesn't there? A lot of the attacks on naval facilities in Crimea seem to be done by drones or potentially even by people on the ground. Is there a reluctance on the part of Ukraine's allies to allow them to actually strike targets with the missile systems, and especially in Belgorod, which of course is a strategic military hub? It seems Ukraine is having its hands tied behind its back to an extent.
So this is an important question, and while I have supported, I think 95% of the Biden administration's approach to support for Ukraine, this is one area where I think we've got the policy wrong. That not providing ATACMS, for example, to Ukrainian forces, which have the 300-kilometer range, out of a concern that they would use it against Russian targets inside Russia. Of course they would. Of course they should. I mean, there are Ukrainians that are being murdered every day by rockets, Iskander missiles, aircraft, and drones that are being launched from inside Russia and inside Belarus. But the Ukrainian General Staff or the Kyiv has said, okay, we won't do that, but let them have ATACMS so that they can hit Russian targets in Crimea. It's exactly 300 kilometers from Odessa to Sevastopol. So if they had ATACMS, they could already be making Sevastopol untenable for the Black Sea Fleet, as well as the other Russian airfields, ammunition sites, headquarters, all the things, and of course, Kerch Bridge, and the other logistics capabilities that the Russians need to continue to defend in southern Ukraine. So I think this is the wrong policy, and I hope that it will eventually change. But I think there are, I mean, these things don't happen in a vacuum. I think, of course, Ukraine can hit targets in Russia whenever they want with what they have. I wouldn't claim to be privy to conversations between Washington and Kyiv or London and Kyiv about what they can and can't do with their own capabilities. But I think that the Ukraine has got to be able to protect themselves, protect their citizens from these attacks.
And those attacks, which in some part, I mean, are less strategic, they're more in line of revenge, it seems. Or it could be just that the Russian missile system is no longer accurate anymore. But if Ukraine was to start a Crimea offensive, we could see the retribution, the anger, and the need to create some kind of, violent gesture for Russian TV audiences. That would increase still further, wouldn't it?
Well, in your lead-in, you identified exactly what these attacks on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure is all about. It's to weaponize refugees, to get hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians heading into Central and Western Europe in search of places to live, while not just during the winter, but because it's not just about heat, it's about water, it's all the things that depend on electricity, businesses, etc. So because the Russians realize that they have no chance of winning on the battlefield, I mean, Ukrainians have irreversible momentum. So the only chance for the Russians is to drag this out in hopes that we all lose the will to continue supporting Ukraine. So by weaponizing the refugees and also trading bodies for time, these very unlucky, recently mobilized soldiers who are being fed into the battle as cannon fodder, is all about dragging this out. And I think my frustration or the flaws in my own assessment are that I don't know how much more the Russians have in terms of precision weapons. I see different reports like you do of estimates that they're down to 30% or 40% remaining of different types of weapons. There have been reports of pretty high failure rates of some of the weapons, that they either don't hit the target or they don't detonate, or they're not as effective. So there's a quality thing, fortunately, in some of the weapons, and because of sanctions, they're not able to replenish all that they are using. That's why stopping the flow of these Iranian drones is also got to be a part of the effort.
And I've seen some figures as well. I know it can't be exact, but similarly, their artillery pieces seem to have a high failure rate. Now, I don't know whether that is common to all such systems or whether it's because they're using Soviet-era stock. But those failure rates must be having a dent on their capabilities to push forward.
Are you talking about Ukrainian artillery?
No, the Russian artillery shells. I saw a figure that it's 20 or 30%. I need to go back to the figure failure rate even of artillery shells. And what it also suggests is that there's going to be a high amount of unexploded ordnance in the areas that either Russia was shelling or mines. Again, territories they've recently left are apparently now some of the most mined in the world. So you've got this incredible problem of unexploded ordnance sitting there.
So artillery that's being fired. I mean, they have had to pull things out of storage. So you've got older systems and excuse me, ammunition that is not been properly stored. I mean, artillery ammunition is not like hammers. You just leave them on the shelf forever and then use it whenever you're ready. They have to be properly stored, maintained. Typically, armies in peacetime, you use oldest ammunition for training so that you've got the newest ammunition for crises. And it's kind of a process there. The Russians obviously are deep into old ammunition now. And of course, the rate of fire that most of them are using, and the Ukrainians, by the way, exceeds all the normal planning figures. So it's not just about ammunition consumption; it's about the wear and tear on the howitzers themselves. I mean, for an American howitzer, and I suspect for British howitzers, British Army and German and others, for an American howitzer, depending on the rate of fire, generally speaking, after 2,000 rounds, the tube has to be replaced. Well, these artillery pieces that the Russians and Ukrainians use are way beyond 2,000. So part of the logistics supply chain, if you will, has to include getting in new tubes for the artillery. Where are those being manufactured? If you don't replace them, at some point you're going to have structural failure in the breach, which leads to either loss of capability, the rounds don't go as far, they're not as accurate, or you have an explosion and it kills or injures a lot of the crew members.
And we're seeing a lot of that, aren't we, with, say, planes crashing into apartment blocks and so on. We're seeing technical failures that are leading to extraordinary loss of life in Russia itself. And I follow some of the channels. I think Ruslan Lviv is one of the Russian, commentators, opposition commentators on this. And just through accidents alone, it's been reported that more Russians have died this year than in 2 entire years of actual Russian military losses in the Donbass. Yeah. So it's an extraordinary failure.
I would believe that. Look, we have sergeants all over the place that are constantly working to help make sure soldiers don't hurt themselves, through either dangerous driving, unsafe driving, how you handle explosives, weapons. I mean, that's part of the reason having sergeants in our formations is so important, is because they have experience and they can anticipate when a young private is going to make a mistake. And of course, it's a dangerous environment to begin with. You don't have sergeants in the Russian army that are on top of these kind of things, making sure people are not, we call it muzzle awareness, that your weapon is loaded and that you're not pointing at another soldier, and accidents that can happen, or the mishandling of explosives. And we've all seen the pictures of how Russians dump artillery ammunition on the side of the road, and it's incredible. For aircraft accidents, of course, if you're not trained, pilots in the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Air Force and other NATO air forces spend hundreds of hours every year in the cockpit, but also in simulators, dealing, making sure they can maintain a level of proficiency. That's also very expensive. And what we're seeing is that Russian Air Force does not have that level of, they have not invested in the training level to do that. And so a pilot who's not experienced and well trained in a high performance aircraft, the chances of accidents go up. And then finally, equipment failure. I think one of the things that I missed before February that I had failed to anticipate is the impact of corruption on Russian military performance. I overestimated their capabilities, and I think I did not appreciate the depth of corruption that shows up in lack of quality control of what the defense industry provides to the services. I mean, there's a we have people that's their job, is to constantly make sure that equipment that's provided meets the specification of the contract, et cetera. And it's obvious that has not been happening in Russia for some time. So this not only has this been a catastrophe for Russian military forces and the government, not too many people are going to be interested in buying Russian kit for several years.
And that extends to food as well, doesn't it? Basic supplies, equipment, clothing, winter clothing, of which apparently millions of uniforms have sort of disappeared, or perhaps were never even sort of manufactured. And the sort of things like sort of maps and food supplies, and we've seen many images of ridiculously out of date and poor quality supply side stuff, and that demonstrates not just incompetence, does it? But that demonstrates an absolute callousness to their own troops, to their own people, and to life in general.
Yeah, you think about it, everything that a soldier uses, wears, eats, drinks, everything he or she does, there's got to be a supply chain that provides it. And while it's cool to sort of mock the tooth to tail ratio and that sort of thing, the fact is modern warfare requires enormous amounts of maintenance, fuel, and if you've got 100,000 soldiers, that's 100,000 soldiers that have got to eat 2 or 3 times a day. They have to have ammunition. They need boots, socks, belt buckles, everything. And the report that I saw, like you did, of over 1 million bits of winter warfare equipment, clothing gone missing. I'm skeptical that that much ever existed, but somebody probably got paid for it anyway. And then the report that they're having to import winter uniforms from North Korea. I mean, if that's true, how bad must it be inside the Russian economy that the country that has Siberia has to import winter uniforms from North Korea? I spoke with a gentleman the other day who was a former South Korean soldier, and he told me that the quality of what North Korean soldiers wear in wintertime is terrible. So I can only imagine what this is going to be like if that report is true. The bottom line is that the Russian logistics system was never designed to support sustained large-scale land operations outside of Russia. They never thought they would have to do it, and so they don't have the infrastructure. So they're clumsily trying to push stuff to the front, but they don't have it. And of course, the Ukrainians, who know everything there is to know about the Russians, the people, the organizations, the weaknesses as well as the strengths, have very cleverly targeted the logistics system, going after rail networks, transport capabilities, and artillery ammunition as a way to defeat Russian forces. And this is also, Jonathan, and then I'll shut up. This is why they have so cleverly gone after the Kerch Bridge and the land bridge, the only 2 land lines of communication into Crimea. So Crimea, in effect, becomes a trap for Russian forces.
And there are, excuse me, there are indeed reports on Russian telegram channels and so on that people are once again starting to flee Crimea. And in fact, there is a behind-the-scenes attempt to evacuate. And of course, while the Kerch Bridge still stands, because we couldn't envisage further deterioration of that structure through attacks, they may well be trying to get civilians out at this point, seeing, as I think they did, quite long in advance, maybe not Putin, but I think they saw Kherson and the fall of that coming, and probably delayed by several months dealing with it. But they now probably realize that Crimea is going to be a target, and they've proved very incapable of holding on to territory that they won early on in the war and in 2014, don't they?
Yeah. So, again, on my long list of personal mistakes where I overestimated Russian capabilities, they have no operational experience. I mean, I had sort of thought, okay, man, they were in Georgia, Syria, Africa, Crimea.
Chechnya, that's a while ago,
yes,
of course, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And so I thought they must have so much operational experience. And it turns out that only about 5% of the military, including the Air Force and Navy, actually had operational experience. And very, very little of that was against anything like fighting against Ukrainians, except in the Donbass region. and the Ukrainians stopped them in the Donbass region. So I should have picked up on that. What the Russians do well is mass. As long as they got lots of people and lots of artillery, they clearly are willing to absorb any number of casualties as long as they can keep pounding away. Ukrainians know this, of course, and so they're looking at ways, how do they undermine or degrade Russia's ability to do these things. And you can have 10, 20, 30,000 brand new troops sitting in trenches, but that does not equal fighting power. We know from millennia of history that soldiers fight for things, for their comrades, for understanding what this is all about. And in the case of Ukrainians, they're defending their homeland. The Russians are not. They don't want to be there. They're not defending their homeland. They know that their leaders don't care about them, and that is, I think, as weather gets worse and worse over the next couple of months, I would really hate to be a Russian private recently mobilized, sitting in a bunker as HIMARS are raining in on top of me.
Exactly. I mean, it's tough enough for Ukrainian civilians, but they do have an extraordinary ability to self-organize. And I've seen pictures of people going to makeshift tents or, institutions in a particular town where they actually have heat, they can recharge their phones, etc. So Ukrainians have this incredible capability to get through the hard times by coalescing and by supporting each other, and I would say innovating. We've seen the images of Russian trenches and so on. Not only do they not self-organize, they tend to live in abysmal circumstances and don't support each other. I mean, to an extent, or to follow on what you said a minute ago about Russia's tactics, I mean, one tactic is artillery and mass. The other tactic, of course, is terror. And one of the reasons they won in Syria was aerial terror, chemical weapons terror, and basically also using Assad's torture regime, the secret services, and so on. And we've seen that in full operation in Crimea. They've turned Eastern Ukraine into a Stalinist state with the kind of behaviors that we haven't seen since the 1930s. I'm going to ask probably what is a very obvious question, but I have heard journalists sort of brush these things off and say, well, war is war, this stuff happens. But it seems to me that the behavior of Russians in bombing maternity units, in bombing clinics, in destroying cultural institutions, in clear genocidal behavior with mass graves and so on, is this normal in war, or are we looking at something that is particularly and cruelly Russian in nature? Because it's not random. I mean, it's a strategy.
Yeah. So this is normal for Russians in war. This is the Russian way of war for centuries. In part, as you and I have discussed earlier, I mean, the nature of the society, it's a brutal society. And when you've got so much corruption from top to bottom, it's not a big jump to get to where you have organizations where theft and brutal treatment is tolerated, almost expected, and then the next step is murdering civilians with their hands tied behind their back in towns that you capture. And so, and the theft of everything that we've seen. I mean, it's kind of funny at first, but then when you think about it, I mean, if they're stealing washing machines and refrigerators, you can imagine what's happening to the people that live there, the treatment that's going on. So no, this is not just part of war. Terrible things happen in war, but nobody should think for a second that it's accepted as the norm. Over the last couple of centuries, a lot of work has been done to try and limit the destruction, the brutality, and to limit the targeting of civilians. It's a violation of war. It's a war crime to target civilian infrastructure that is not directly related to military requirements, capability. So everything that the Russians are doing now is a violation of multiple articles of the Geneva Convention. Fortunately, the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, is on the case, literally. Taking a look at the various war crimes of which there is ample photographic and personal evidence that's out there. So people are already starting to do those kind of things. And in particular, this terrible, I hate to even think about it, but the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian kids that are being sent to Russia. Exactly what Stalin did. I mean, this was a Stalinist tactic, but the czars did it also to move populations around to gain control, to depopulate areas. It's an element of genocide. Genocide is not just killing everybody, it's depopulating an area to change the demographic balance there. And this is what's been going on. It's part of the design. Putin's objective from the beginning has been the destruction of Ukraine as a state and the idea of Ukraine as a state.
And it's not even deep history. I was reading about one very elderly Tartar man who was actually deported as a young child from Crimea, as the Tartars were deported en masse from Crimea by Stalin. And within one person's lifetime, it has happened to him again. I think he's in Europe now. So this isn't deep history. This isn't long forgotten stuff. No. This is within family memory. The Holodomor, the genocide, the intentional genocide by Russia, by Stalin against Ukraine to break its will. These are all within family memory.
Yeah. And it's going to take a long, long time for this, for it to fade into distant memory. I think what has happened now, it's hard to imagine Russia re-entering the sort of the community of responsible nations anytime soon. I can't even imagine any of the faces that we see on TV now or in media of current Russian leadership. It's hard to imagine any of them being welcomed to any international body. I'm talking about Lavrov, Putin obviously, but Lavrov, Medvedev, or any of the other ministers and diplomats. I can't even imagine them being welcomed at Munich Security Conference, or which, by the way, Munich Security Conference has not invited Russia to send a delegation to Munich this coming February, or other international bodies. And I'd hate to be the Russian ambassador to the UN right now. I mean, you're a pretty lonely place.
It is, and only one diplomat out of the many thousands they've got around the world has actually broken ranks, and he's clearly got to look after himself because he's a marked man at this point. But it's extraordinary, isn't it? That, you know, I was going to come to this question later, but I think it's quite a good time to reach it now. You know, talent is really not a requirement to get top jobs in Russia, and we have to be honest about that. It's extreme nepotism and corruption. You've got Suvorkin, Kadyrov, and Prigozhin now as three of the most visible people in the military aspect of this campaign. All three of them are pretty unsavory characters, aren't they? And they're not ones you could imagine on the international stage.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting and important that we watch closely what happens in Russia over the next 6 months or so, as this catastrophe continues to unfold and as more and more Russians become increasingly aware of it, and as the effects of sanctions and battlefield casualties and all the disruptions of what passes for normal life in Russia are felt by more and more Russians, I think there is going to be a real power struggle. And Jonathan, you would know more than me about, I'm not a criminologist, but as a outsider looking in, it feels like what's just below the surface is going to burst onto the surface pretty soon in terms of the competition. You know, Dr. Timothy Snyder the other day, he said, yes, it's bad to lose in Ukraine. It is much worse to lose in Russia. And so when people say, how can you even imagine that Putin would leave Ukraine or that they would lose? I mean, as if that's impossible to imagine that the Russians would lose or that they would leave. Now, they will absolutely leave when they realize that just continuing to get beaten in Ukraine is going to lead to the fall of the regime, or their own ouster will cause people to start protecting themselves. inside Russia. And the three figures you just named, Surovikin and Prigozhin and Kadyrov, they are power centers. Shoigu and Gerasimov, nobody even says their name anymore. I mean, because none of these three characters are taking orders from the general staff. They're getting it directly from Putin. And so the normal sort of command and control, the structure for planning and making decisions, strategic thinking is not in place there.
It's medieval in that sense, and you've got competing power centers and no real constitutional structure. I've also spoken to Yuri Fershinsky, who's got a Russian historian who co-wrote a book with Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned, and he makes the case that there was far more internal democracy, far more balance of power in the Soviet Union than what you've got now. Now is a sort of frightening, arbitrary process, very much dominated by the security services, with no balance from any party structure. Whatever you thought of the Communist Party, there was a balance in the Soviet Union between the Communist Party and various secret, state organizations, constantly at war, but it provided us a modicum of, a variety of opinions behind the scenes. Now you've got, it's very difficult to know. I mean, from Russian history, my only take here is that unlike democracies that tend to, they do have major shifts, but the system is built to envelop those in some way. In Russia, it's more like a tectonic shift. Nothing happens for a long time while the pressure's building up, and then you'll get sudden, unexpected changes, which everyone says couldn't possibly have been predicted, but nonetheless, and knowing what we were talking about there, and before we came on the recording, we were talking about how some experts, not necessarily military ones or those who've been active in the military, but more of the sort of military analysts and pundits have repeatedly got this whole situation wrong. And I feel the same is happening now as the clamor for a negotiated peace is growing, especially as we go into winter. Ukrainian economy is under pressure, etc. I don't want to name any names because there are various people on in the military as well who are talking or hinting at this. But isn't a negotiated peace really? Can that only ever be temporary? And it only really provides Russia a chance to rearm. I don't think a permanent peace without a Ukrainian victory is really possible.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. The only winner in a negotiation would be Russia. Of course, that's what they want, is to put pressure on European capitals and on the U.S. to put pressure on Kyiv to hurry. Oh, come on, we got to stop this. It's terrible. It's so expensive. We got to. All wars end in negotiation. I hear this all the time now, and so the Russians would benefit from that. It would give them a chance to rebuild and regroup and get their act together to deal with the deep-rooted problems they've got which have been exposed. And so it would also entail Ukraine forfeiting sovereign territory. So, in other words, Russia's war would be rewarded. And I don't know how anybody, serious person, thinks that this is the right step to take. And I think there are some really good, smart people that are having a hard time getting their head around the idea that Russia is going to be defeated, because they can't imagine, because that would undo decades of what we believed or what we thought we believed. And so it's hard to break free from some of our own previous assumptions or beliefs. I think also there are certain ideas that are out there that don't make sense, but because people are either they are in their own memories, or they haven't challenged it, or they have assumptions that need to be challenged. When I hear, well, surely there's going to be somebody even used the fighting season framework, which we used in Afghanistan. There was a fighting season because when it was pouring rain, the Taliban they went back to Pakistan or they stayed home. So there was in a way, a fighting season. There is no fighting season in Ukraine. And when I hear people talk about, well, of course, they'll have to slow down. They're going to stop during the winter. No, in the 18th century, people stopped during winter because there was no forage for the horses. But that's not a requirement now. And yes, trafficability for wheeled vehicles is more difficult, particularly in that part of Ukraine. The soil is really a mess when it's wet, but tracked vehicles can still move. And yes, visibility will be lessened, which is a problem for some of the drones that are just purely optical visual capabilities. But the Ukrainian soldiers are going to be much better equipped to continue operations during the winter than are the Russian soldiers. I mean, there are so many things. Not only do things move slower, but equipment needs different types of lubricants. For example, you're going to use up a lot more fuel because soldiers will sit in vehicles and keep the engine running for the heat, or they're going to be needing fuel for heated facilities. I mean, all of these things add to the logistical burden, and that weak, fragile Russian logistics system that we talked about is getting worse and weaker by the day. So the Ukrainians, I am convinced, will want to keep pressure on the Russians throughout the winter, not give them a chance to get back up on their feet, to rebuild. And I anticipate that they will be in position January, February, to begin the final phase, the decisive phase of the campaign, which is the liberation of Crimea.
And I suspect, given that phrase you mentioned earlier that Timothy Schneider came out with, no one wants to lose in Russia because that is a death sentence. If, as I think, Prigozhin is a smart but awful person, they will be seeing this coming. And rather than perhaps expending all their forces in the war, surely those who have a view to, with an eye on the Kremlin, they will be withdrawing or keeping some of their force in reserve for that battle that is going to come,
exactly,
as you say, in the new year.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's, again, they don't take orders from the general staff. And you remember there was about 3 years ago, maybe, where some Wagner soldiers ran into American soldiers in Syria, and they were slaughtered. And there is some reporting that the Wagner guys were allowed by the Russian general staff to get slaughtered. They didn't get any support, and it was a message to Prigozhin. He'll remember that, of course, and so I think you're right that he's growing his force and saving it for his own purposes back inside Russia, should it be necessary, or should he see opportunity.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the unpredictable element that comes in as Ukraine drives forward. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because looking at some of the analysts and I would say less historians, because historians seem to have quite an interesting view usually on things, but many of the analysts seem uncomfortable with the idea of a decisive Ukrainian victory. It upends, I guess, as you said, so many decades of their thinking about the power structures in the world. Maybe even books and papers they've written will become redundant. Where does this resistance of the idea of a change in the world order really come from? Because Ukraine will become an extraordinarily powerful force within Europe, and obviously within the defense of Europe, and possibly, as their tech industry grows, they're becoming a dynamic force in many areas of progress.
I think it has something to do with nuclear weapons. In the post-World War II era, almost every major war that we've seen or in which we've participated, first of all, they were never declared wars. They were known as operations or police actions or different, operated under a UN mandate or something like that. So the idea of a decisive conflict, a decisive victory to bring about termination of a conflict seems, I think, to so many people as old-fashioned, because the assumption was that somehow the Soviets or the Chinese would have used a nuclear weapon, that it would somehow end up in a nuclear conflict. And so that I think that caused us all to move towards negotiated conclusions, whether we're talking about Korea, Vietnam, various other conflicts around the world. I mean, the only exception, I could be found out as being wrong very quickly by some of the listeners, but think of Desert Storm. Obviously, that was a conflict that was brought to a very quick, decisive termination. Although people would argue that it didn't go far enough, but nonetheless, in accordance with the war aims, that was decisive. The Israelis, of course, have achieved a decisive victory at times, but that didn't bring about eternal peace either. So I think that's part of it. We've gotten into several decades of non-conclusive or non-decisive, I should say, end game. That's why this feels probably awkward, as you say, for many people. They can't imagine that. You mean there's going to be one army has to leave the battlefield? I think that's what's going to happen. And as you've also pointed out very well, this is why now I know why so many people listen to your podcast. This is not happening in a vacuum. I mean, all of this chaos that's happening in Russia, economic, political, violence, is going on. And Russia's main ally right now, Iran, is dealing with very, very serious problems of their own right now. And the Chinese must just be watching and anticipating when they can regain some of the territory that they lost to the Tsar centuries ago. So Russia is in a bad place, and at some point, I think they were going to have to leave Ukraine the way we had to leave Vietnam and we had to leave Afghanistan, and take and secure themselves at home.
And I think this is not a prediction anyway, but to an extent, China is playing quite an interesting war of attrition. I mean, the word attrition is a very dangerous one to use. I've heard people argue that in some ways the US is playing an attrition game here by eking out supply of weaponry to destroy Russia. I've heard that on both sides, that sort of interesting but rather devastating argument. But to an extent, China is playing an even bigger and more cunning game, isn't it? Because if Russia does collapse, and I know I've read you comment that that's not something we should wish for, it's not something we should plan for, but we should plan for it. It may happen whether we like it or not. China could very well sweep up from the south. I mean, the resources, the territory, the agricultural land, these are all things that the huge Chinese population need. It could get exceedingly messy in years to come.
I think the Chinese are indeed watching exactly for the part that you referred to, and they've been extracting resources from Russia for some time, and the Russians actually can't stop it. I mean, they don't have the population or the capabilities to even stop that. But the Chinese are also watching, I think, to see can the West stick together and help Ukraine defeat Russia. Are we willing to put up with some high energy prices and other disruptions for a period of time in order to see this through, to help Ukraine finish this and defeat Russia? If we're not willing to do that, then that'll be a message to the Chinese that maybe we're not able to stick together to deter or stop them in the South China Sea, for example. The first part that you brought up, though, this is also frustrating for me. Why does it feel like we're spooning out capabilities to the Ukrainians? Now, Secretary Austin, I'm sure, would say, wait, $40 billion is hardly spooning out anything. But in terms of capabilities, why does the administration have a hard time saying we want Ukraine to win? I mean, those words were issued only one time. Secretary Austin said, we're going to help Ukraine win, and we're going to damage Russia enough so that they can't threaten their neighbors anymore. That was never heard again. I mean, that was the White House put a clamp on that. And so we're not willing to provide the ATACMS that we talked about earlier. We're still unbelievably, we're not willing to provide tanks. We have thousands of tanks that could be refurbished and provided, as do the Germans. And of course, the Germans say, well, if the Americans aren't doing it, why should we have to provide tanks? And So that all stems from a we're just not able to bring ourselves to say we want Ukraine to win. We want Russia to say we want Russia to lose. That's like 75% of saying we want Ukraine to win. And I think there are still good people in our governments that are worried about an escalation, which I just think is not going to happen.
And that's a lesson we haven't really learned from the Second World War, isn't it? If we'd intervened at various points, potentially Hitler, as has been written in his diaries and interviews, would have, fled with his tail between his legs when they retook the Rhineland and so on, if the British had gone in. But there's a certain need to normalize the situation. There's a certain reticence to go all out. I think we're of one mind on that one, definitely. And one of those moments happened last week, didn't it, that put real pressure on the Western Alliance, and that was the missile that strayed into Polish territory. Whether it was part of the air defense system or whether it was a Russian missile, that seemed to create an extraordinary media furore. And I found that bizarre. I mean, that's not to discredit the two people who lost their lives. That's absolutely tragic. But a few years ago, an airliner carrying literally hundreds of Europeans was shot down by a Russian missile system, by Russia's proxy army in the Donbass. I mean, none of this, separatist movement nonsense. That was an extremely sophisticated system provided by Russia. They haven't really been held culpable for that in the criminal case that was decided last week. And I find it a little hypocritical that the media get into such furore over the missile last week, and yet really little was done to respond to that act of mass murder that Russia committed a few years ago.
I think this points to a lack of understanding of how NATO works, what Article 5 is all about, and of course, because of the double-edged sword of social media, information and misinformation can travel at the speed of light. And so it was an amazing thing over the period of about 24 hours, how many times on Twitter you see people calling, this is Article 5, the Russians did this, what's America scared of? I mean, it was this kind of reaction and response. And I think for me, there were two or three takeaways from the whole incident. Number one, how impressed I was that the Poles, the Polish government, if anybody would have been overreacting, it would have been Poland, partly because of their history and their belief that everything Russia does is aimed at the destruction of Poland, there's a reason for that. But they were pretty calm, I thought, and I took my cues from Warsaw. The fact that they were not reacting so strongly, I thought, okay, they know something, or their assessment is that this probably was not what it might have looked like. That was the first takeaway. The second takeaway is NATO, our alliance. NATO is often accused of being too slow. I was impressed with how quickly Secretary General Stoltenberg was able to say, we think this was, not, or it's clear that it was not a Russian deliberate attack. And so people ought to take some encouragement and comfort from that we're not going to be emotionally drawn into a conflict that goes nuclear, which is what I think many good average people think could happen. Now, I was also impressed that along with other world leaders, Chancellor Scholz of Germany said, it doesn't matter who fired that missile, it's Russia's fault. I mean, that's for a member of the SPD, Chancellor of Germany, to say that, that got my attention. And it really is reckless incompetence by Russia to be launching missiles or going for targets so close to the Polish border, knowing that there's a potential for something to happen that could lead this. Now, maybe they did that on purpose to see what the reaction is. Some people think that. I think it's more reckless incompetence.
It's interesting to see, and I haven't exactly got to the bottom of this, but where they clearly orchestrated something like the poisoning of the Skripals and various other incidents, you tend to have an immediate barrage of multiple conflicting propagandistic stories immediately fly up. And then you trace them back and realize they were prepared in advance. Therefore, you can say, well, actually, none of this was an accident. Russia did it because, you've got the smoking gun. I don't think it's quite as clear on the missiles as to whether the stories are fabricated in advance or not. But yeah, it's completely reckless for sure. We've only got, I think, a minute or two left because I know you've got another engagement. And the key question, I think there's two questions. One very quick one is, if Russia was to cause a meltdown of the Zaporizhia power plant as part of their sort of hybrid warfare, scorched earth to create a nuclear accident, how would we react to that? And the other question is, at the end of this war, when Ukraine wins, which we both believe they will, what is going to be the state of Russian military, its inventory, and its military-industrial complex?
So I think the international community has got to be working 24/7 right now, putting pressure on the Kremlin to make sure that nothing happens at Zaporizhia or up at Ostrovets at the nuclear power plant in southwestern Belarus. I just came from Lithuania, and they're very worried about that. So this is 100% the responsibility of the Kremlin, and I think the international community, everybody, has an interest in making sure that Russia does not allow that to happen. That's got to be at the top of the to-do list. As far as what happens to the Russian military after this, the United States Army, we had to do a lot of soul searching and reform after Vietnam. We had thousands of sergeants had been killed. We were American society in the mid-70s was not in a good place. And we had to rebuild ourselves, and it took a complete change of culture, of self-criticism, of what we call the after-action review, and changing our training model, where you go to the National Training Center and you get beat over and over and over until you finally get better. So hard, realistic training, and then investing in our NCO education system. Those were the three things. I had an old guy tell me those three things saved the U.S. Army after Vietnam. And thankfully, we had the right leaders in place to be willing to do that. I don't know that Russia has enough senior people. They're very smart, they're well educated, but the culture of accepting responsibility for something that went wrong, that's what it's going to take. You can't fix something until you can identify, why is it broken? What happened? How did it happen? That will require a serious cultural change. Otherwise, Russia will just build back what they started this with.
And that's not just military culture, it's social culture. You can't operate the top-down, nepotistic, corrupt society and have a hope to implement the reforms that you've mentioned.
Right.
Well, Ben, I know you have to rush. It's been, again, a massive pleasure speaking to you, and your insights, I think. We got so many positive comments on the channel last time. So people, I think, will be delighted to see you back on it. And it's amazing work you're doing in the media.
Thank you. And Jonathan, thanks for the privilege you gave me today.
Thank you.